Welcome back to another episode of the Adventure Box Podcast. This is Zach Edwards with another episode. Here, I have to say, I never expected to get so much into African history. But today's Thursday, so I want to tell you about African history, ancient African history. Now, if you're part of the ancient civilization curriculum, if you're buying that, this is the episode for you. Basically, I'm going to tell you my fascinations with Africa now that I've actually been able to study some of it. Again, I've been doing this for just over a month, which means I haven't even scratched the surface of it. But for all of you, it's not really, you don't want to actually get into the real dirt of everything that's going on in Africa. And I shouldn't say dirt, but I mean, there's a lot of sand all over it. But I don't want you to have to worry about going into all the great detail unless you become fascinated with it as well. So I now am starting to love the people in there and the history behind it because it is absolutely fascinating. Now, we like to say in America, in the United States, that we have one of the most fascinating histories, but that's not true at all. So everywhere has its own fascinating histories. Now, ours was a mixing pot of hundreds of cultures, of groups from every European country, Africa, Asia. I mean, it was a mixing pot of that made America what it is today. But Africa is something different. It's very much the same and yet very different. So we're going to go through this. We're going to go through some of the fascinations that I have and some of the reasons why this has got to be one of the most important and one of the most fascinating continents anywhere in the world. And yet, you don't really hear about that. We don't teach this in American schools. We don't teach this in South American schools as much. Africa, according to my friend, again, who's from Kenya, and actually he got me really interested in learning more about this. But he basically told me, James, told me that I needed to learn about Africa. I need to learn about the actual history and not what European history was or even what Middle Eastern history told about it, but what the actual history is. Because Africa is actually one of the most advanced civilizations of its time at that point. But you'll actually see why it actually changed for them. Now, we're not going to go past European history in this point because we're talking about the ancient civilizations. And most of the time, besides the Roman influence, until 1400s, about 1400s, when there was wars between the Iberian Peninsula and Morocco and I forgot its name. It will come to me in just a second. Carthage. So besides the interaction between the Iberian Peninsula and the Carthage area, Morocco and such, I never really knew. It's not really that. We're not going to go into European history as much coming into Africa. So everything that we're going to be talking about is everything predating the 1400s. So because we're going to be talking about ancient history. Okay, so in ancient history, now I already told you about the Green Sahara. I talked to you about domesticating animals. This is the Neolithic era. This is when they're starting to create tribes, create groups. We're actually going to jump forward a little bit to about 300 AD. Now, we're going to be talking about a little bit before that as well, but this is very important to actually learn about. Okay, so first off, actually, we're going to start a little bit before 0 AD, and we're going to talk about where's my image? There's my image. We're going to be talking about this continent, or this civilization. These are the remains of what used to be the ancient Ghana Empire. This was one of the largest empires, and actually, I'm going to go one better than this. We're going to start off, let's go back even further. Before the Ghana Empire, there was, and that's about 300 AD. Before that point, one of the largest groups in all of Africa, almost half of Africa, was taken over by one group of people. And I'm going to classify them as one group, even though there were hundreds of groups. And this is the Bantu, the Bantu speaking people. Now, again, many different tribes. There was the Shone, I think was the name. I've got to look it back. But there's all these different tribes that were all speaking the same language in Africa. Now, this was mostly southern Africa. This is basically where Africa has the, and let me show you a map. If you're looking at a map, otherwise I'll explain it. So this is the outcropping of North Africa, you know, where it's like it's almost like something's overflowing out of a cup. It's overflowing, it's coming out towards the west. That area, not Bantu speaking, or at least if there was, it was mixed in that point. But everything basically below the halfway, the middle line of Africa, everything below was Bantu. They were all speaking the same language, Bantu. And these were major tribes. These were some of the strongest warriors in the world. These were the most understanding of their environment. And again, their advancements were based on their civilization, their survival. They wanted their people to survive, so they learned everything they could having to do with survival. So these are amazing people that basically took up about half of Africa, the lower half of Africa. And so these people were creating this great civilization, and again, breaking off into many different civilizations. And if you can see the map, you'll see that the rainforests are right in the middle. This is actually where the homeland of the Bantu speakers were, but their stretch was everywhere from the middle line all the way down into South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia. So that's quite interesting. Now, let's go a little bit more. So today we're going to be talking about the complex societies in Sub-Saharan Africa. But we're going to go a little bit before that. So the curriculum is going to tell you about that. We're going to go into like a preview of what you're going to be learning in the next 3 weeks or 2 weeks, depending on how you cut it up. Okay, so first off, let's talk about the Ghana Empire. So the Ghana Empire was basically on the west coast. Let's bring up the map again. It was on the west coast of Africa. Now, the west coast of Africa, again, where it looks like something's overflowing from a cup, going to the west, that area was one of the major areas in Africa. Major when it comes to trade, major when it comes to empires. These were groups that came together and formed their own complex societies. So in this area, and again, we're going to be talking about all complex societies, even though this was supposed to be just the Sub-Saharan, which means underneath Sahara Desert. Okay, so you have the Ghana Empire, which then was taken over by another one. This one was called the Mali Empire. So when we talk about the Mali Empire, we're going to be focusing a lot on certain aspects of it. And please do your own research on additional parts of the Mali Empire. It's way too big to put into one chapter. So we gave you a snippet of what you will learn about the Mali Empire. I could literally write a whole curriculum off the Mali Empire. It is so fascinating. But one main person really fascinates me. And he is probably not just the wealthiest man in all of history. Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, all combined. He was the wealthiest person because he was the king and controlled all the gold in the Mali Empire. And this is bigger than any country inside of Africa today. So the empire was very large. And so he had so much money, he went on a Hajj, which is a Muslim pilgrimage back to Mecca, where basically Muhammad started it all. Now, interesting enough, in this history with Mansa Musa, who is the name of the king, Mansa Musa rides east. He has, let's see, thousands of servants and slaves and soldiers. He has hundreds of camels carrying about 24,000 pounds of gold. That's like $800 million today. $800 million, more than $800 million with today's currency exchange. He took that money, and on his walk east, it is Islamic custom to give away things as you go. Now, no one had ever seen this amount of money given away. Mansa Musa, he was highly intelligent, very strategic. He knew what he was doing. So he goes through, and he goes into Egypt, through Cairo, and he starts passing out all this gold. And everyone's, oh, he's so generous, so generous. He's giving us all this stuff. Yes, this is great. I'm going to be able to afford bread and everything else because I'm poor and I don't have the money. Problem was, he was very strategic, very smart at what he was doing. And yes, he probably had some, maybe he had some generous tendencies to him. But no man in his position ever does not know what gold will do if you flood an economy with gold. What happens to the value of gold if all of a sudden it's not rare anymore and everyone has it? The price goes down. So if you want to buy a loaf of bread, instead of having a coin, you will have to have a handful of gold to buy that bread because the gold is worth little or a whole lot less. So he goes into Cairo and starts passing out all these things. He starts doing construction projects, building mosques. That's it. Building mosques in Egypt and basically giving out all this gold, not just to the poor, but to the rich as well. He was getting to everyone because he wanted everyone to know how wealthy he was, but also how powerful he was. $800 million passed out to a single country or a single city, Cairo, Egypt. They're not as big as the United States. They have less people, or they did at the point, have less people than we have now. So what happens to that economy? It goes crushed, destroyed. So for decades afterwards, over a decade, I'll say, the economy was destroyed. Mansa Musa, on his way back to Mecca, he started seeing some of the effects of giving out his funds. Did he stop and try to take back the money? No, he didn't. He kept going. And why is that? Because his biggest competitor was, since he was in Mali, which had silver, salt, and slaves. What did Egypt have? They had gold. I say salt and silver. Sorry, salt and gold. Gold mining was his major commodity. Egypt was the biggest trader of gold. So what happens to every market around? They all tanked. Who had salt in addition to the gold? Mali did. Who had slaves to sell in addition to the gold? Mali did. So a lot of times people brought the gold back, not having it be worth anything, and bought more slaves with it. So a lot of that money he collected because he would sell off slaves, sell off gold to all these countries where the gold was flushed. So what happens? He collects it back. I mean, brilliant. This guy, economically, fiscally, brilliant. He had so much money and gave away so much and got so much of it back because he was one of the biggest producers of salt and one of the biggest producers of slaves. Now, of course, he wanted other things, so he could trade other things instead of gold and get those things for even higher price as well, or giving out less for more of those commodities because, again, they were worth less as well because there was all of a sudden a recession in not just Egypt, Ethiopia. Oh man, I got all these pop-ups that come up. Ethiopia, down the coast of the eastern African coast. And we're going to go into that next. Okay, so what happens? Mali at the peak was around the time of Mansa Musa, but then it kept falling apart. What happened? Okay, so during this time, during the time of Ghana, what happened to make everything start to change in this very complex society? Well, they were traditional African religionists. So they believed in African religion, stuff that had been around for forever and that they believed in. But then what happened? The traders came in. Where did the traders come from? They came from the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire took over around the Crusade time, took over a lot of the Middle East, everywhere from, again, Jerusalem, because of the Crusades, took over Turkey, took over Istanbul, which used to be Constantinople, under the Byzantine Empire. So many places. So there was no trade routes over land, which is why all of a sudden they had to go by ship, which is what spurred the Europeans to go over sea, was because they couldn't compete, they couldn't bribe their way through, and they didn't want to be captured and sold into slavery if they tried to go through the regular trade routes that were set up well before Muhammad and the Islamic traders started taking over for it. But the Islamic traders then started moving down to Africa. And what happens? They start putting their influence in different places. So the traders, in order to get in close with the traders, you actually had to convert. Now, you didn't have to convert. It was not forced upon you. But in order to work with them, it was a lot better if you did become Muslim or become Islamic. The reason was because they ran under Sharia law. Their contracts were under Sharia law. They were, they had cultural differences. They had language barriers as well. So all of a sudden the the Ghana Empire started to collapse on itself. And the Mali Empire started to build completely based on a religion, on the Muslim religion, Islamic religion, sorry. Muslims are people, Islam is the religion. Okay, so what happens at that point? They start banking on it. Again, Mansa Musa goes to Mecca. All these things happen. But what else happened? So complex was the society, and we're going to go over this next week, that in the society, they created universities. They created libraries. They created places of thought, which made it become one of the most advanced nations in the world. Again, not technologically advanced, but more mathematics, astronomy, and such. Very much like the Greeks at the time. But the Greeks were actually before. So a lot of the information was just collected in that area. Remember the Library of Alexandria through Egypt? Same thing was happening over in the Mali Empire. So what happens to the Mali Empire? After a while, it begins to crumble. You can read about it in the curriculum, and we'll talk about it next week. But that opens up to another, well, no, actually, it's not supposed to be there. Another one, which was Shanghai. The Shanghai Empire came in completely Muslim and also came in with warriors and conquerors to take over land. And so this was actually one of the, besides Mali, this was one of the largest empires when it came to slavery, slave trade. So the Shanghai actually gathered slaves from all over Africa. They went into the interior and took from the Bushmen. And we're going to talk about them in just a little bit. The Bantu people that were not in very complex societies that were defensible. They were taken over. And so this is actually a mosque in Shanghai, or that was in the Shanghai Empire, and it still stands today. Again, the climate is very dry, and the way that they did it keeps those buildings together fairly well. Very smart when it comes to the architecture and such. Okay, so then the Shanghai Empire comes in. Mali Empire crumbles, but it's still around. It's not completely gone. And Mali becomes a country later on. So what happens to Shanghai? Shanghai actually goes into its decline when the trade route started to dwindle. The Europeans, they were gathering the slaves, but at the same time they were gathering slaves. And if you want to learn about slavery, go back one day to the American history. I know it's not American history, but I actually talk about the history of slavery. That's a really good one to actually listen to. But Shanghai, as the trade routes start to crumble, so does Shanghai, because it's based on trade. Slaves, gold, salt, and such. Okay. So moving forward, what happens? So are there other groups that are out there besides those in the West Africa? Okay, so let's come into this. Let's go over to the map again. So we were talking about Western Africa. Let's now go down to the East Coast. This is what we would call the Swahili culture. So the Swahili were actually a lot of different cultures altogether, or sorry, a lot of different tribes altogether. They made up this culture that was the Swahili. Now, the Swahili was all up and down the East Coast. And what happened? Well, actually, the Muslim traders came in again. So they came down through Ethiopia into the Swahili land. And what did they do? They started to influence the same exact way they were influencing Western Africa. They influenced Eastern Africa. So they came in, and all of a sudden, the people there wanted to work with the traders, and so had to convert to Islam. But no, I don't want to tell you too much because we're going to be talking about it tomorrow. But here's another one that's very interesting. Great Zimbabwe. It's actually in Zimbabwe, but this was a civilization called the Great Zimbabwe. It was more of a city state. It was like a it was a large city. This was the complex in the middle. This was the defense mechanism. Now, they loved traders. They worked with Swahili coastal tribes to trade. But here's something really interesting. Until the Muslim traders came down, there was no slavery on the East Coast. The Swahili, there is no evidence or records that there was ever slavery in that time until the traders came down. When the traders came down, all of a sudden, there was slavery, and they started selling slavery. But the Great Zimbabwe was the middle. It was the country that basically separated Swahili land from the interior. But they did not like slavery. They did not like bondage. And though they may have had some sort of type of bondage, there is no record of it. And so they did not like slavery and did not trade in slaves. They traded in gold, ivory, and so forth. But what happens all of a sudden if, let's see, the market for somehow, I don't know how it happened, somehow the market for gold tanked? What would happen to a country like the Great Zimbabwe away from everything else? Well, just like, again, slavery and gold, they were the two largest traded commodities besides salt. Now, again, I'm not saying that humans are a commodity, but to them they were. Again, looking at the eyes of the people living down there. So what happens if the gold goes down? This society goes down as well. So it is actually fairly certain that because the gold prices came down in Cairo in Egypt, the hub, the center of the gold trade, everyone else felt it. Now, the Swahili were still selling slaves. They were still selling other things. The Great Zimbabwe, one of the major things was gold. The next one was ivory. What happens if those two disappear? There's no more society. And they started to break up, and the society broke apart and is gone. Well, there's one other one I wanted to mention. This is the Mapungawe. The Mapungawe were a tribe just like the Great Zimbabwe. They also did not trade in slaves. Even though they worked with Swahili coastal tribes, they did not trade in the same way. And they were actually around for a little bit longer. Now, I know we're hitting our time, so I'm going to go into some other things that are very important that you're going to be reading about in this week's chapter, in this week's section. So this is the San people, S-A-N people. These were hunters and gatherers. But what's really interesting about them is they were not a complex society. They never created empires. They barely had cities. They mostly had villages. They never wanted materialistic things. They were not about it. They're like it's a little bit different, but the Amish of Africa. Anyone that does not want the materialistic things, this was them. They appreciated family. They appreciated living. They appreciated survival. Their advancements were based on their survival and still are today. Yes, they're still around. Unlike all these other civilizations, this one, not based on materialistic things, continued to be strong as they are today, as they want to be. Now, there have been plenty that have left that society to grow into Western or more civilized societies. But these people live nearly the same way that they lived thousands of years ago, or 1,000 years ago. Yeah, I think I could say thousands, around 2,000 years ago. They're still around. And why is that? Because, again, they did not rely on the materialistic things. They did not rely on power. There's a humility, a humbleness to these people. Now, I love that they're still going today. They are still thriving with hunting, even though some of the countries are trying to take away their land and trying to take away their power, trying to take away their ability to live their own culture, much like we somewhat did with the Native Americans, whether it's the reserves that we put them on or up in Alaska. I was part of Fish and Game. I think I've told you this story before, but as Fish and Game, we had to regulate how much fishing was being done. The people in the tribes in what we call the bush, not like the African bush, but the Alaska bush, they were actually wanting to fish, and they wanted to fish a long time because they sold the fish to fisheries, to canneries. Well, what happens if they run out of fish? See, not to go too much into it, but the life cycle of salmon is they spawn in a lake, they go into the ocean, spend 7 years out there, and then come back to the exact same lake. What happens if they catch all the fish going up to that lake? It means there's no babies. It means that those babies that go out and try to come back in, there's not as much. And then this time they're going to be caught even more. And so there's less babies to come out for the next run. And what happens? All of a sudden, there are no fish anymore. So because they were selling their fish to the canneries, they had to be regulated. So the governments are doing the same thing. The African governments are doing the same thing to the San people, who again are still around. It's much like the Aborigines, those that live naturally in their own habitat, how they were hundreds of years ago. Again, I don't know about them because I haven't gotten that point yet. But this is fascinating to learn about. They would hunt with actually like very small bows. Now, not small as in tiny, but small as in probably like 2/3 the size of a regular bow that we would hunt with in the United States. And they had small arrows, but they would poison those arrows, which would put the animals to sleep so they didn't feel pain. Yes, this is like survival and care for the environment. These people hunted with fairly short arrows and nearly just needed to prick the animal in order to make him go to sleep. And then they could, why can't I think? I was going to say dissect, but that's not dissect. They would skin them and harvest them. And the animals wouldn't feel anything because they'd be dead. They'd be asleep and then be dead. They'd be dead. And where did they get the poisons? From nature. Fascinating what they can do. And they went after one of the big things that they went after, different types of antelope, but the gemscock are the antelope out there in mass quantities. And they would go after these. Very quiet, very patient to get close enough to shoot a small arrow to prick one of these so it falls asleep and then they can kill it. Fascinating. And they actually knew the environment very well. Now I don't know if this was a pet. This was actually an article that talks about how they are so in tune with nature that they can actually work around the animals. That this cheetah could rip that guy to shreds. Nope, they're actually working together. See? Isn't that very interesting? It's got to be a pet, right? I don't know. But Africa is so fascinating because there's so much more than just this. There's so much to learn from that's not usually talked about in American schools. So by listening to this podcast, by reading the curriculum, you're going to be learning a lot more than your teachers have any clue about. Like you just learned about the Bantu people, which were Bantu speakers and had many, many tribes. But a lot of people that go back to African history, a lot of them don't know where they're from, which country they're actually from. And so settling on the Bantu is probably a great choice. They're a great, very honorable society, or were at the point. Now it's all mixed between everyone. The only one that's not really is the San people, which is also a great civilization, a very humble and honorable society, as far as I can tell. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you can actually feel the fascination that I have. This is amazing information. This is amazing knowledge that I never knew about, because in high school, they never taught me about anything in Africa, hardly anything in Europe, nothing in Asia. Why not? This is some of the greatest history in world history. So stay tuned. We're going to give you so much more. Each of these societies that we were talking about, we're going to go in depth into each of them. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for joining me on this Thursday. Again, this is week 6, day 2 for ancient civilizations. But yeah, we will talk to you soon. Take care. Bye. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.